To the uninitiated, they look almost like fireworks in the night sky, but make no mistake, cluster bombs are weapons of death. Weapons the US, opposed by some of its key allies, has decided to unleash in Ukraine, creating a ticking time bomb for future generations. 50 years from now, a Ukrainian child will be blown up while playing in the dirt. The culprit, history tells us, one of the most brutal weapons on the planet. It's called a cluster bomb, a large shell filled with small bomblets which, when dropped from above, scatter over a wide area, exploding in every direction. They're devastating weapons, tearing through armoured vehicles and maiming whoever is nearby. That's if they detonate, and up to 40% don't. Those dud bomblets, or bommies as they're also called, lying dormant for decades, looking a hell of a lot like toys to unsuspecting kids. In Laos, the most bombed country per capita in world history, the Americans were secretly dropping cluster bombs during the Vietnam War 50 years ago. Since then, more than 20,000 Laotians have been killed or injured, about half of them children. Children like 11-year-old Lo, who, digging in the dirt with his mates one day, found a small metal sphere. Thinking it was a bocce ball, the kids brought it home, tossing it around. It exploded on the spot, wounding Lo and killing 2 of his friends. That's why 123 countries, including Australia, have promised to ban them, and why Joe Biden's pledge this past week to send American cluster bombs to Ukraine is so controversial.
It's a very difficult decision on my part.
Difficult, perhaps, but it's a decision America keeps making in Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, in Serbia and Kosovo, in Iraq, Kuwait and Afghanistan. Those other cases involved America invading. In this case, Ukraine's asking for the cluster bombs to be used in its own territory for its own defence, which makes America's decision more understandable, but not necessarily right.
Russian forces moving exceptionally lethal weaponry into Ukraine, which has no place on the battlefield. That includes cluster munitions, which are banned under the Geneva Convention.
That was America's rep to the UN when Russia first used cluster bombs in Ukraine. The transcript of those remarks has since been edited to remove this reference because, as it turns out, US cluster bombs apparently do have a place. Also, an asterisk was added saying that the ban only applies where the bombs are directed at civilians.
The difference is that Russia is using cluster munition to attack, to invade Ukraine. Ukraine is using cluster munition to protect itself against an aggressor.
The problem with that distinction is that cluster bombs are, by their very nature, indiscriminate. Forget discriminating between soldier and civilian. They don't even discriminate between current and future generations. The Americans argue most of their cluster bombs won't be around to haunt future generations.
The ammunition we are delivering to Ukraine will consist only of those with a dud rate less than 2.35%.
Except that rate applies to bomblets tested on hard, flat land. On the battlefield, technicians observe something more like 14% don't explode. The US's other argument, the damage is already done.
We have to ask ourselves, is Ukraine's use of cluster munitions on that same land actually that much of an addition of civilian harm, given that that area is going to have to be demined regardless?
But demining is slow, dangerous work. At current rates, Laos won't be bomblet-free for another 100 years. So adding more is going to be costly. In the end, the argument becomes that the Ukraine war is the exception. That yes, cluster bombs are terrible, yes, they should be banned, yes, they will devastate for generations to come, but that Russian victory is too terrible to contemplate, and that threat justifies any means necessary. And that's an attractive argument, but it's one that requires caution, because you can end up applying it to every war. The cause is always urgent, loss is always intolerable, the enemy is always evil, and extreme measures will always then be justified. At some point, if you're not careful, every war becomes an exception to the rules of war. So the least we can do is make sure there's truly no way for Ukraine to prevail with conventional weapons, even if that requires more support from us. Because you'd hate to think that we're resorting to cluster bombs because it's cheaper or more convenient. I'll leave that judgment to weapons experts, but let the rest of us demand one thing: that the choice we make will still feel justified in the wake of that explosion 50 years from now.
doesn't feel right not to stick to some sense of rules of engagement when it comes to weapons and ammunition and bombs that are used in these sorts of scenarios. And why are humans so intent of inflicting so much pain on each other?
And the Russians have been dropping heaps of theirs on Ukraine. Let's make no bones about that. I mean, what they've been doing has been atrocious. But you're right, we keep inventing these things that make war ever more barbaric. The really tragic thing, I think, is also, even if people don't die from the bomblets, when they're there, you can't use the land. So it means farming can't happen, you can't build roads, poverty starts to spread. It's a real turning point. It's a big decision in this.
And that generations of years on will have to pay for it.
Well, it's ignorance is bliss, isn't it? But it was so hard to watch. No child ever should have a nursery rhyme that is, if you see a bomb, don't touch it.
Yeah.